What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. It's your boy jonyfraze. For today's video, we are tackling the age-old debate on which controller scheme is better for fighting games. Is it pad, is it stick, or is it now stickless? Alright, let's break it down. First being rough costs. Next up, we're going to go over the pros as well as the cons of each controller style. And then, I think this is really important and it's not really brought up a lot, especially in the fighting game community. That is how these controller styles will impact your health. Let's get into the cost of pads nowadays. I have a few listed here on the screen. Most of them are just the ones that I've been hearing about, the ones that I've seen at tournaments, and the ones that are readily available to buy. 20 bucks for this Betop Fightpad. It's this one right over here. It's a 6-button style pad specifically for fighting games, and I'm hearing that the performance per price is really good. For 50 bucks, you can get this Hori Alpha fight pad. It's the latest generation of Hori's fighting game specific fight pads with the 6-button layout. They added an analog stick, the touchpad, as well as all the bumpers on top, which is kind of nice for this new generation. So for 60 bucks, you get the stock Xbox Series S/X controller. Now, I see these at tournaments often for people who feel that the Xbox controller is more comfortable rather than the PS5 controller. Typically, they have to pair this with a Wingman FGC converter from Brook to make it work on PS5. Next is the stock DualSense 5. I don't really have to talk much about this. It's the one that comes with your PlayStation 5. It's definitely one of the most popular controllers in the fighting game community right now. Next up, upgraded version of the DualSense. It's the DualSense Edge. It's basically Sony's answer to all the mod controllers out there, and they just decided to make their own and have a performance version of their stock controller. 200 bucks though, it's going to set you back. There's also third parties that make pro level pads, and the example I have on the screen is this Victrix Pro BFG. You could swap out some of these components. For instance, you can make the D-pad primary, you can actually rotate this and make analog primary. They have a 6-button arrangement for fighting game players. It's pretty cool, but it's going to set you back 180 bucks. So within the same category, there's also a group of companies that make custom controllers for each console, and they're roughly around that $200 plus range. A company that I can think of is Scuff. So let's get into the pros of using a pad. You already own one and are very familiar with it. Since it already came with your console, you don't really need to buy anything else. You can just use it right away. They work great for the most part, and most developers already design their games around this style of controller. Next point, fairly quick inputs with full access to controls and buttons at all times. It's designed for your hands. You have easy reach to literally every single button on this device. Probably the most important for using this thing. It's lightweight and compact. You can put it in your pocket. It's super easy to travel with. Honestly, I'm a stick player and I'm super jealous when I see pad players just rolling up with a pad because it's just so much easier to travel with. Next up, it can easily be purchased anywhere and can be usually found at events to borrow if something goes wrong. You could just run outside to any big box electronics store and buy a replacement. Next point, the analog stick gives you access to SOCD tricks like Stickless. Being that you have both your D-pad and the analog, you can do dual directions. Even though it's a little awkward, you could still hit both of the directional inputs at the same time, as I'm doing right now. You can use a claw grip, or you can kind of just extend your thumb over. A ton of people use pads. They've won major tournaments. Notable players, Punk, NuckleDu, Mena RD, IDOM, Anakin. Nowadays, pad is just a staple of the fighting game community, and back in the day, it used to be frowned upon to use pad at tournaments, but these days are over. But there's also some cons. First being failures. The D-pad fails, analog sticks have drift, and sometimes there's just damage to the USB port preventing it from being connected. From my conversations with top players, I've heard some of them go through as many as 3 pads a year, sometimes more. So with that said, when you buy a new pad, there is some time to break in the D-pad specifically. The buttons, for instance, they could be a little too punchy when you first get them, but you do need a little bit of time to break in. Next, hard to repair, mod, customize on your own due to small parts and special tools needed. So most people just usually send these out to repair shops or companies for any modifications. It's not like the arcade stick scene where you could just open up with a couple screwdrivers, replace a button here and there. It's a little bit more involved. Next point, it depends how the TO set up their systems, but I'm just going to bring it up anyway. Wireless syncing can disrupt tournaments, so if you leave your DualSense still connected to a console, and then you walk away, and you didn't disconnect it or desync your pad, and then while it's in your backpack, you accidentally hit the PlayStation button, it then syncs up to the console that you were just on, interrupting someone's game and ruining someone's match. It happens, but nowadays on the PlayStation 5, you can actually set the console to wired only, which is kind of taking away this issue, but still a thing. Moving on to health concerns for pad. First being that it's fairly good ergonomics. This thing literally is the shape of your hand, and it conforms to your hand, and for the most part, they feel good for most people. Next up, it allows the full use of your hands and fingers to distribute inputs and kind of spread out the work that you need to do to play games. Just like when you overuse anything, playing for long periods definitely can cause pain in the hands. I'm sure you've heard of gamers, getting injured by playing on pad, specifically back in the day, like Smash players, for instance. So there are some risks. Now, I'm going to rate it like a moderate risk of repetitive strain injury because although it's one of the more ergonomic style devices, you could still definitely get injured. And then the last point's actually pretty important, being that these are kind of the default devices you're going to be using for gaming. There's a lot of accessibility options in the console menus as well as Steam. Okay, let's move on to the cost of sticks. First up is entry-level Qanba Drone 2 for $100. Nowadays, these entry-level sticks have gotten so good, and the drone has always been like a good starting point for a lot of people who want to try stick for a low cost, and that continues with the Drone 2. Another great example is this Mayflash F700, for $150. Got some really nice parts in there. It's a good form factor. They've been making these F series of sticks for a long time, so you guys should really know about these nowadays. Next up is a staple in the Fightstick / fighting game community. It's Hori. They've been making stuff since I've gotten to the scene years and years and years ago. But Hori's latest entry is this $175 to $200 fighting stick alpha. Some of them are licensed with like Street Fighter or Tekken, for instance. You can just lift up the hood. You can swap the art. You can swap buttons very simply. It's one of the better retail sticks that you can get out there. Like Hori, Qanba has been a staple in the fighting game community for quite some time and definitely know what they're doing as far as the products that they're putting out. The Obsidian 2 costs around $240, and moving up the chain is the Victrix Pro FS. A lot of stick players use this controller because it's really robust. It has a full metallic frame. On the flip side, the door opens up and you have easy access to all the parts, but all these little perks get you a higher price of around $320. And then next up, if you're looking for a custom arcade stick from makers such as me, for instance, it's going to roughly cost you $300 and up because you have to pay for artwork, your own parts, labor, things like that. All right, moving on. Pros of using stick. Now, it's a familiar layout for legacy players. If you grew up playing in the arcades, you already have a good feel of how to use stick. Also, it's amazing to play retro games. The joystick offers fluid circular motions. And what I mean by that is that the range of motion on stick feels really good for the most part. You could do 360s easier. If you do quarter circle motions, it's very fluid and has a nice flow to it. Someone like me who DJs on the side, or maybe you play an instrument, you might actually feel that this is the better input method because you already have the muscle memory to do things like that. Next up is that most retail sticks offer good quality parts, Sanwa or better, with great performance right away. Nowadays, the bar has been set to what the Sanwa standard was, meaning that Sanwa made the JLF joystick, and that was the bar for quality for joysticks. Same with their buttons, the OBSF button series, the bar for how a button should operate. So nowadays, a lot of these companies are making their products at least that good or better. The retail models that you see on the screen here are really good examples of that. The next point is my favorite part, actually, is that sticks are pretty easy to repair and replace parts. Yeah, it's a little intimidating when you first crack your stick open, but then you just realize it's not that bad. You have to just unplug a couple wires here, pop a button out. If you have any motor skills, you can definitely repair your own arcade stick. And that leads into having a huge community of modders, builders, graphic designers, DIY enclosure makers, and hobby and part shops. It's amazing. There's like this really awesome hidden FGC within the FGC, and it's something that I'm really proud to be a part of, and it's one of the things I love most about using stick. Sticks typically last a long time, meaning multiple console generations, saving you money down the line. For instance, the first generation of the Mad Catz Tournament Edition Fight Stick, I see a lot of people who still use this stick. Since 2009, they've had this stick. Whether or not they're using a converter or they just replaced the motherboard in there, all the parts are still working great. It's insane. Some notable players are Angry Bird, won Street Fighter 6 Evo, Big Bird, Sako, Execution God. And then I want to shout out the Tekken community very specifically for keeping stick alive, because there's a lot of modifications you could do with Korean style levers. And then Tekken legends like JDCR, for instance, still using stick. There are some cons. First thing up, sticks are freaking heavy, man. They're bulky and they're heavy. And you need a backpack. They're not fun to lug around. They give you trouble at airports. They're like, what the hell is this thing? It's true. Next up, the joystick itself has more travel time than Stickless. You literally have to move from left to right. Now, I don't know how many frames that actually would be, but there definitely is some travel time from left to right, or up to down, or just going around the actual stick. I can keep 2 fingers on left and right at all times. So to go to left to right on Stickless is obviously much faster. Even pads have some travel time because you actually have to use your thumb to travel from left to right. Next up, sticks don't have access to SOCD tricks. Sticks typically don't have access to both the D-pad and analog at the same time. Next up, if you're at an event or tournament, it's a little harder to find replacement parts and to just fix at an event. Sometimes you didn't bring a screwdriver. You know, sometimes your specific button that you like, no one has a spare for you. These things happen. When I'm at events, a lot of people, knowing that I mod arcade sticks, just run up to me and be like, yo, Johnny, can you fix X, Y, and Z? And some of the times I'm not even there as a vendor. I'm just hanging out. And people expect me to fix their stuff because they know that I'm one of the guys that can do it. But if I don't have my tools, you're kind of screwed. The best situation is that some of the vendors who sell parts are actually at events, like Arcade Shock comes out to events a lot. Paradise Arcade, another good example. If those guys are around, you're kind of in luck, but still, it's a little bit of a risk. We talked about this during the pros, but it also could be a con. To buy a stick is definitely a little bit more costly than any other product at the moment. Even though they last a long time, like we just discussed, the price of entry is still pretty high. For a decent arcade stick, you're probably going to be spending around $200 at least. It could save you money down the line, but initially the costs are a little bit more. Now I put the next thing under a con because modding can get addictive. Like, once you start getting to arcade sticks, you're going to want to start exploring different style of buttons and different levers and modifications to your levers and getting custom artwork. The stuff can get addictive and expensive. Okay, moving on to health concerns with stick. You need to use your whole arm for the joystick. At least when you're learning. As you get more precise, you're kind of just using your wrists more and fingers. But yeah, it is kind of like a little bit of a workout. Next is that certain button layouts are just not ergonomic. Okay? The standard Vuelix layout, it doesn't really conform to your hand that well. Now, your pinky doesn't really fall where this last punch button goes. But some button layouts, like for instance, the Hori stick uses the Noir button layout, which has a little bit more of a curve. So you have to pay attention to that when you're choosing a stick. Don't just look at the overall product, but look at the button arrangements, because some of them can be better for you and healthier for you to use. Being that you are using more of your arms, especially on the joystick side, so if you're not careful over time, it could lead to tendonitis, tennis elbow, carpal tunnel, etc. Again, overuse is always a thing. Just be really careful. And because of that, there is a moderate to high risk of repetitive strain injury if you're not careful. $70 gets you one of these Haute42 T16s nowadays. Okay? Really low price of entry to learn how to play stickless. You can buy this on Amazon. It's insane. $90 gets you the stickless version of the Mayflash that we saw. This is the F700. You know, really amazing option out there. $90. $165 gets you the Snackbox Micro. They're the originators of the flat keyboard style stickless controllers. Some of the big players started getting into this thing. $300 for a Razer Kitsune. Around the same price, the originator of this whole stickless movement, Hitbox, has just released a new product called the Ultra. And then you're seeing some new entries from Victrix with their new ProKO with swappable buttons and stuff. $250 for that. And then there's these WASD keyboard style controllers like the Mixbox Universal, around $450. Fun fact, I did the logo and the artwork for this specific model. And then obviously there's a custom scene. Go anywhere from $100 to whatever. For instance, on the bottom right here, we did this amazing Stickless build for the homie Knuckle as a prize for winning the Chipotle challenge. Let's move on to some of the pros of using Stickless. All right, number one, very familiar for keyboard players, right? If you grew up gaming on a computer, you should already kind of be familiar with pushing keys as far as directions go. Next up, it's a lot more easier to travel with than a stick. Depending on which model you get, some of them are ultra lightweight, like the Snackbox Micros, and sometimes you can just put them in your pocket. I know the Haute42 models, some of them are really tiny and definitely fits in your pocket. Stickless controllers don't have a stick, right? So there's no lever sticking out to kind of get in the way when you're slipping something into a backpack. I say pad still has an advantage, but Stickless is definitely a lot easier to travel with. We talked about this earlier. Minimal travel time for directions since you are pressing buttons instead of a D-pad. You can keep your fingers on all directions at all times and press down whenever you need one of those inputs rather than moving a joystick or using your thumb to travel left and right on a pad. This is probably one of the most important parts about using Stickless, in that there's lots of shortcuts for inputs and to do special moves, for instance, to do supers, for instance. And being that you have access to all the directions at the same time, there's tricks with SOCD. SOCD stands for simultaneous opposite cardinal directions. And don't forget, your right hand has access to the buttons as well. A lot of tech involves using your right thumb. Now, just like stick, it's pretty easy to repair and replace parts. The biggest issues I've ever seen with these guys are like the switches dying. Some of these flat style controllers like the Haute and the Snackbox, sometimes the switches fail, but you can simply just pop out the switches, replace the switch, put the cap back on, you're good to go. Some of the ones that are more like a typical fight stick will have arcade style buttons like the Mixbox and the Hitbox here. You could pop these off and just replace buttons as you would a normal fight stick. Now, being that stickless controllers are still considered fight sticks, they're still part of that huge community I talked about earlier with modders, builders, graphic designers, DIY makers, hobby part shops, etc., which is awesome because you see a lot of creative stuff coming out of this community. Some of the notable players that I had off the top of my head, two gods right away, Tokido and Daigo. One of the younger players making some noise in the scene, Nephew, for instance. And I know there's a ton of players out there who've moved from pad and stick to using stickless nowadays. The last point I wanted to make is that there's a lot of options and sizes nowadays for stickless controllers. That's a good thing. A lot of options are a good thing. But it can also lead to some cons. And the first one is that the quality varies heavily due to lots of manufacturers hopping on the trend. So definitely do your research before you make a purchase. I'm not going to name names, but some of these controllers out there have known for failing ports, and you have to get it repaired or buy another controller or send it back. So definitely do your research before you buy any of these controllers. Next point is really important. Some of these controllers, by their default setting, is not tournament legal unless some buttons are disabled. Here's an example. Here's my Haute42 T16. As you can see, this is the standard all-button layout, and there's 4 extra buttons. In a game like Street Fighter 6, for instance, you are allowed to map 3 of the shortcut buttons, but a 4th is not allowed. But there's 4 buttons on here. On this specific Haute42, when you first plug this in, you're going to notice you have 2 jump buttons, and that's not allowed in Street Fighter 6. So to make this legal in a Street Fighter 6 tournament, I would have to disable one of the jump buttons, and that's just one of the default settings. So just keep that in mind as you're playing games. Know the tournament standards, and maybe have some profile set up so you know you're playing with a legal specification. I find that the learning curve for learning advanced techniques is a little bit higher than pad and stick. What I mean by that is that being that there's multiple buttons on here and there's a lot of little tricks for SOCD, there's a lot of right hand tech, there's a lot of muscle memory needed to learn how to do these certain advanced techniques. It's a pretty high learning curve. For instance, Hitbox, right? And Mixbox. These guys both have a YouTube channel where you can learn all these techniques. And I've tried them, and yeah, they're awesome once you get them down, but getting them down is the freaking hard part. And then to add another layer on top of that, SOCD rules change per game, so you may have to adjust your execution per game. For instance, in Street Fighter 6, up and down must equal neutral. But certain games still allow the older method where up cancels out down. Right? So that changes drastically how you learn some characters. You're basically typing when you're using a stickless controller. So a lot of people who have office jobs, for instance, get hurt with carpal tunnel, they get tendonitis, etc. You will be prone to these same typing injuries. And with that said, there is a moderate to high risk of RSI. A lot of these stickless companies will tell you that it's the more ergonomic option, but I would take that with a grain of salt because it may not be completely accurate. You are using a lot of the smaller muscles that are in your hands and wrists, and that over time can lead to a repetitive strain injury like those typing injuries we mentioned above. I would highly recommend that you try out a stickless controller before you make a purchase to see if you're even comfortable using it. Now, there are alternatives out there. There are these hybrid controllers called Hitsticks. I make them, for instance. So this guy has a joystick as well as WASD, as well as the stickless component. And you can kind of have best of both worlds. Junkfood Arcades just released this new controller called the SWORL that have access to these like thumbsticks as well. So you can go check that out. And then there's this category of customs called pad boxes, which are basically D-pad style movement with arcade buttons. I actually made one of these back in the day and kind of like semi-broke the internet. But either way, there are these hybrid options out there that you could check out, and maybe these will work better for you. And obviously there's a lot of custom controllers that people have made to kind of fit their needs based on ergonomics and style. Final thoughts is that, honestly, just use whatever's comfortable for you. You know yourself best. You know your hands best. You know how your mind works best. When you're at events, maybe ask someone to borrow one of their controllers to test out and just see if you like it, see if you can get into it. I actually know a couple players that use a specific device for the game that they're playing, which is kind of crazy because they have to carry a bunch of controllers around, but you know, again, use what's most comfortable for you. Next point is that there's a lot of options out there. Unfortunately, the level of quality for most of the products you see in these categories have risen in the last 5 years, so just by doing a little bit of research, you'll probably land on a solid product. Definitely practice good ergonomics when gaming, as well as taking breaks to rest your hands, whichever input method you use. There's a bunch of exercises you guys can find on the internet to help you with this. Trust me, as someone that suffered with tendonitis, if you're a hardcore fighting gamer, this will 100% catch up to you if you are not careful. So take care of yourselves, guys. So ultimately, this is your decision to pick which input method is the best for fighting games. I personally use stick because of my experience in the arcade, as well as some of the muscle memory I have from some of my other hobbies. Everybody's physiology is a little bit different, so you have to decide which controller method is best for you. So let me know in the comments what you guys think about this topic, which controller methods you prefer, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you like this content. I'm jonyfraze, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace.